In the summer of 1877, somewhere between midnight and dawn, Charles Ingalls loaded a wagon in darkness. Not the romantic prairie darkness Laura would later write about, the kind where Pa's fiddle filled the night and the stars felt close enough to name. This was different. This was the darkness a man moves through when he owes rent he cannot pay. The wheels turned quietly on the dirt road outside Burr Oak, Iowa. Carolyn held baby Grace close. Mary and Laura, still half asleep, climbed into the back without asking questions. They had learned by now not to ask why the family was leaving again. Behind them, in a rented house near the edge of town, the landlord would wake to find them gone. The Ingalls family owed money, and Charles Ingalls, the man millions of readers would come to know as the patient, honourable Pa of Little House, chose to drive away rather than face what he could not pay. Laura Ingalls. Wilder remembered this night. She wrote about it decades later in her unpublished autobiography, Pioneer Girl, the manuscript that would never become a children's book because some truths do not fit inside a cosy log cabin. She remembered the wagon. She remembered the silence. She remembered knowing, even as a 10-year-old girl, that something was wrong. But when she sat down in the 1930s to write the Little House series for children, she left Burr Oak out entirely. Not just the night departure, not just the unpaid rent. She erased the whole town, the hotel, the saloon next door, the year of grinding poverty that came after grasshopper plagues destroyed the family's farm in Minnesota. She gave America a pair who worked hard, loved deeply, and always made things right. She did not give America a pair who drove away from debt in the middle of the night. And before we go any further, let me be clear about something. When I say Laura erased this story, I do not mean she destroyed it. I do not mean she lied in some calculated, malicious way. The historical record still exists. Pioneer Girl still exists. The town of Burr Oak, Iowa still stands. And the Masters Hotel, the only childhood home of Laura Ingalls Wilder that remains on its original site, is a museum you can visit today. What Laura did was this. She shaped memory into myth. She took the jagged, humiliating, complicated truth of her childhood and refined it into something children could hold on to. Something that said, if you work hard and love your family, everything will be all right. But the truth is more expensive than that. And tonight, we are following the wagon. If you're someone who loves Little House, who grew up believing in Pa Ingalls as the model of frontier integrity, then please subscribe now. Because this story is going to challenge what you thought you knew, and you're not going to want to miss where this goes. Let's start with what we know. By the summer of 1877, the Ingalls family had been in Burr Oak, Iowa, for nearly a year, longer than they had stayed in some places, shorter than they had hoped. They had come to Burr Oak in the summer of 1876, fleeing the wreckage of their farm near Walnut Grove, Minnesota. Grasshoppers had stripped the fields bare 2 summers in a row. The family had sold their land and moved east, not west. A retreat, not an adventure, to help run a hotel owned by a family friend named William Stedman. The Masters Hotel was built into the side of a hill. There was a saloon next door. Men drank, fought, and hung around the entrance. Laura, 9 years old at the time, was frightened of them. Caroline Ingalls hated the noise, the smoke, the proximity to a world she had worked hard to keep her daughters away from. Charles Ingalls had agreed to help manage the hotel. It was not farming, it was not homesteading, it was survival work, trading labour for room and board, with no land to claim, no crops to plant, and no way to build the kind of future he had always promised Caroline. And it got worse. After a few months, the relationship with the Stedmans soured. Charles moved the family out of the hotel and into rented rooms above a grocery store. Then he took a job at a feed mill. Then they moved again, this time to a small rented house on the edge of town. Carolyn gave birth to Grace there in May 1877, a 4th daughter, born into a family that had no stable home, no savings, and no clear plan for what came next. And somewhere in that summer, after months of grinding poverty and mounting debt, Charles Ingalls made a decision. They were leaving. Not in the daylight, where neighbours could see. Not after settling accounts, the way a man with means and pride would do. They were living in the dark, and the rent, still unpaid, would stay behind. Here is what makes this story so devastating. Laura Ingalls Wilder did not forget Burr Oak. She remembered it in precise, painful detail. She wrote 20 pages about it in Pioneer Girl, the adult autobiography she tried to publish in 1930, years before the Little House books existed. She remembered the hotel built into the hill. She remembered the saloon. She remembered being afraid of the rough men. She remembered her baby brother Freddie dying on the way to Burr Oak, buried in a cemetery in South Troy, Minnesota. She remembered her mother's exhaustion. She remembered her father's restlessness. She remembered knowing that money was running out, and she remembered the night they left. But when she adapted Pioneer Girl into the Little House series for children, working alongside her daughter Rose Wilder Lane, a professional writer who pushed Laura to soften, simplify and mythologize, Burr Oak disappeared. The published Little House books jumped from On the Banks of Plum Creek in Minnesota straight to By the Shores of Silver Lake in Dakota Territory. There is no hotel, no saloon, no rented rooms, no unpaid rent. There was no night when Pa loaded the wagon in darkness and drove away from a debt he could not face. Laura made a choice. She decided that this version of her father, desperate, cornered, fleeing, did not belong in the story children would read. She gave them the pair who built a door for the dugout in Minnesota, the Pa who played the fiddle while wolves circled the house in Kansas, the pair who walked 40 miles through a blizzard to bring home Christmas candy. She did not give them the pair who left Burr Oak, Iowa, owing rent to a landlord who trusted him. And that omission is not a lie. It is something more complicated than a lie. It is the act of a daughter protecting her father's memory by offering readers a version of him that was true, but not complete. You might be thinking, so what? So the Ingalls family left town owing rent. It was the 1870s, times were hard, lots of families struggled, and you would be right. But here is why this moment matters. Because the Little House books are not just stories about one family. They are the foundational American myth about the frontier, about self-reliance, about what it means to work hard and earn your place in the world. For generations, children have grown up reading these books and absorbing a lesson that if you are good, if you are brave, if you work hard and trust in your family, you will be okay. That is the promise Pa Ingalls represents. But the historical Pa Ingalls, the man who drove away from Burr Oak in the middle of the night, represents something else. He represents the gap between the myth and the reality, the gap between what we want to believe about the frontier and what the frontier actually cost the families who lived through it. Because here is the truth. Charles Ingalls was not a bad man. He was not lazy. He was not a thief, at least not in the way we usually think of that word. He was a man who kept trying, kept moving, kept hoping that the next place would be the place where everything finally worked. And every time it did not work, his family paid the price. Caroline packed up the household again. The girls climbed into the wagon again. And the shame of leaving, of not being able to stay, of not being able to pay, stayed with them, even if the books never said so. This is not a story about villains. This is a story about what happens when hope, untethered from financial stability, becomes the only strategy a family has left. And Laura, writing decades later, understood something crucial. You cannot sell that story to children. Children need to believe that Pa can fix anything, that hard work is always rewarded, that the wagon always leads somewhere better. So she gave them that story, and she left the other one, the true one, the harder one, in the dark. The summer of 1875 did not announce itself as a catastrophe. It came in quiet, the way the worst things always do, on a clear afternoon when the wheat was coming up thick and green along Plum Creek, and Charles Ingalls had, for the first time in years, real reason to believe that everything was about to be all right. He had built a proper house, not a dugout in the earth, not a claim shanty thrown up against a Dakota wind, but an actual plank house on their own land near Walnut Grove, Minnesota. The Ingalls family had arrived at Plum Creek in 1874, and Charles had done everything right. He had chosen good land, worked it hard, planted wheat, and watched it grow. Historians and biographers have noted that this period felt genuinely promising for the family, not just by Ingalls standards, but by any frontier standard. The soil was fertile, the weather cooperated, the harvest was going to be the one that paid off their debts and gave Caroline the kind of settled home she had always wanted. Then they heard the neighbours screaming. Laura described it in both Pioneer Girl and later in On the Banks of Plum Creek. The cloud appeared first as a shimmer on the horizon, catching the afternoon light like a strange kind of weather. Then came the sound. Then came the shadow. Trillions of Rocky Mountain locusts descended on Walnut Grove and the surrounding plains in the summer of 1875, covering nearly 200,000 square miles of farmland across the Midwest, in a swarm that historians have since called the largest insect event in recorded North American history. The estimated crop damage across the region reached $200 million, the equivalent of roughly $116 billion today. Charles Ingalls lost everything he had planted. But one bad summer can be absorbed if a man has reserves, if he has family nearby to borrow from, or a barn full of enough to get through the winter, or land with a value that holds even when the crop fails. Charles Ingalls had none of those things, so he planted again the following spring. The grasshoppers came back. 2 years in a row, 2 harvests are gone, 2 winters survived by the thinness of whatever work Charles could find away from the farm. He travelled east and worked as a farmhand for other families, leaving Caroline alone with Mary, Laura and infant Carrie, sending back what money he could. The plank house on the good Plum Creek land, the one Caroline had finally allowed herself to love, had to be sold. It took the Ingalls family nearly a decade to recover from what those 2 summers cost them financially. That is the part that does not make it into the children's books. The books gave you the beauty of the grasshopper storm, that wild, almost cinematic image of the sky turning silver and the air going dark in the middle of the afternoon. They gave you Laura's wonder at the spectacle. They gave you Pa's quiet steadiness, his refusal to panic, his certainty that the family would get through. What the books did not give you was the accounting that followed. The ledger, if you could see it, would show a man who had borrowed on good faith against a crop that no longer existed. Land payments falling due with nothing to cover them. A neighbour's family watching the same thing happen to their own farm. No insurance, because crop insurance did not exist for frontier homesteaders in 1875. No government relief program with teeth, because the relief programs that were proposed in Minnesota and neighbouring states were often delayed, politically contested, or underfunded relative to the devastation. Charles Ingalls was not uniquely unlucky. He was caught in a regional catastrophe that crushed thousands of farming families across the same years. But that context, accurate as it is, does not change what the collapse meant inside one specific household. It meant Caroline packing up the good dishes again. It meant the girls losing the school they had just started to settle into. It meant the calculation a frontier husband made when he accepted that his land, the thing he had staked his family's future on, had to go. Here is what 1876 looked like from the inside. Charles and Caroline had 5 children by that year, except they no longer did. Their only son, Charles Frederick Ingalls, called Freddie by the family, had been born in November 1875. He was never a healthy baby. Laura wrote later in life that he had suffered convulsions. By the following summer, he was losing weight despite everything Caroline and a called doctor could do. On August 27, 1876, Freddie died. He was 9 months old. County records in Wabasha County, Minnesota, recorded the cause as diarrhea. He was buried on the farm of Peter Ingalls, Pa's brother, where the family was staying at the time, on land that no longer exists. The exact location of his grave has never been found. Laura barely spoke of Freddie for the rest of her life. He does not appear anywhere in the published Little House books, and in the same summer that the family buried him, in the same weeks when Caroline was still recovering, when the farm was already gone, when there was no home of their own to return to, Charles accepted William Stedman's offer. The Stedmans were acquaintances from the Walnut Grove area. They had recently acquired a small hotel in Burr Oak, Iowa, a town in the northeastern corner of the state near the Minnesota border. They needed someone to help run it. They offered the Ingalls family room, board and partnership of some kind. The exact financial terms are not clearly documented in the surviving record, but the arrangement, according to historians, was more survival than opportunity. Charles agreed. He was not in a position to refuse. The family loaded the wagon and turned east, not toward a homestead, not toward free land, toward a job, a labouring arrangement, in a hotel built into the side of a hill in a small Iowa river town. And here is the thing about Burr Oak that makes it so uncomfortable to sit with. It was the right move, by any practical measure. It got the family through the immediate crisis. It put food in front of the children during the first winter after the farm collapsed and the baby died. It gave Caroline a roof that did not depend on a wheat crop. But it was not the life Charles Ingalls had promised her. The Master's Hotel was a working men's establishment, not a genteel inn. It stood near a saloon, possibly adjacent to one, depending on the source. The clientele was rough in the way that small Rivertown clientele tended to be: labourers, drovers, travellers. Laura, 9 and 10 years old during her time there, later described being frightened of some of the men who came through. Caroline Ingalls had grown up in a settled Wisconsin family with a degree of social respectability she had carried with her onto every homestead claim. To find herself raising her daughters in a hotel next to a saloon, in a rented arrangement that depended on another family's goodwill. Biographers note that this period was one of the hardest for Caroline, emotionally, of any stretch in the family's difficult history. And Charles would have known that. He would have felt it. The way a man who has made promises feels the gap between where he said he would take his family and where he has actually brought them. The Master's Hotel is still standing in Burr Oak, Iowa. It has been a museum since 1976, the only childhood home of Laura Ingalls Wilder that remains on its original site. The building is small, framed construction, built into a hill with a wide front porch. From the outside it looks peaceful, rural, quiet. Inside, the boarders' rooms on the upper floor are still there. The rooms where young Laura made beds for strangers, because the family needed whatever the work could provide. That detail is not in the books. The relationship with the steadman eventually broke down. The record is not precise about why, whether it was a disagreement over money, management, or simply the claustrophobia of two families working in close quarters through a hard winter. What the record shows is that by some point in 1877, Charles had moved his family out of the hotel and into rented rooms above the grocery store next door, then later into a separate rented house nearby. He took work at a feed mill. He was no longer a farmer, he was a renter, working wages, in a town that was not his. Baby Grace was born in May 1877, a fifth daughter, the family's last child, delivered into a household with no land, no savings, no claim, and an accumulation of small debts that had no clear path to resolution. This is the moment when the ledger matters, not in the abstract philosophical sense of fairness and frontier mythology. In the plainest, most immediate sense, a man with a growing family, no capital, no land, and wages that covered barely enough. Every month that passed in Burr Oak, the gap between what was owed and what could be paid grew a little wider. By the summer of 1877, it had grown too wide to close honestly, and Charles Ingalls made his decision. He would not stay and face the landlord. He would not arrange a payment plan, or beg an extension, or sell something to cover what the family owed. He would load the wagon after dark. He would put his family in it: Carolyn, who had just given birth months before, Mary, 12 years old, Laura, 10, Carrie, 7, and baby Grace, barely past her first months of life, and he would drive away from the debt, from the rented house, from the landlord who trusted him, before anyone in Burr Oak was awake to see it. That is the night Laura remembered, and here is what she chose to do with it: nothing. She buried it in Pioneer Girl, the manuscript that stayed unpublished for decades. She sealed it away from the children's books, from the readers who would eventually make her one of the most beloved authors in American history. You have to ask yourself why, not cynically, not as an accusation, but as a real question about what it means to love a parent and also know the truth about them. Because Laura Ingalls Wilder, by the time she wrote the Little House books, was a grown woman in her 60s. She had survived more hardship than most Americans of any era. She had watched her husband Almanzo go through his own financial disasters. She understood, better than almost anyone, what poverty does to a person's pride, the way it erodes the image a man has of himself as a provider, a protector, someone whose family can depend on him. She had watched her father carry that erosion for years, and when she sat down to write the story of her childhood, she made a choice that every writer eventually faces. What does the truth cost the people you love? In the Little House books, Pa's the man who always comes through. Pa's the one who says, "We'll be all right, Caroline," and you believe him, because he always is, because the books make sure of it. But that night in Burr Oak, the wagon loaded in darkness, the unpaid rent, the landlord sleeping, that night Pa was not all right. He was desperate, and Laura knew it. The wagon left Burr Oak before the roosters, and here is the thing nobody talks about. When a frontier family disappeared in the night, they did not vanish into freedom. They vanished into the same problem, carrying it on their backs, wearing it in the silence between them on the bench seat. The debt did not stay in Burr Oak. The shame travelled with them. Charles turned the horses north, back toward Minnesota, back toward the same land that had already swallowed 2 harvests and a son. Think about what that decision meant. Not the romantic version, not the pioneer turning his face toward the horizon with fire in his eyes. The real version, a man in his early 40s with a nursing wife, 4 daughters, and no money, pointing the wagon back toward the place that had broken him, because there was nowhere else to go that he could afford to imagine. The open road in 1877 was not liberation. For the Ingalls family, it was the sound a man makes when he has run out of other answers. Walnut Grove, Minnesota was not waiting for them with open arms. The land they had farmed and lost was gone, sold or surrendered, the way things go when a man stops being able to hold on to them. The neighbours who had watched the Grasshoppers take the Ingalls fields were still there, still farming, still trying to pretend the worst years had not happened. Small communities in the 1870s Midwest were long on memory and short on the kind of mercy that makes it easy to return after a public failure. Charles came back not as a landowner, not as a homesteader with a claim. He came back as a man looking for wage work, whatever he could find, in a town where everyone remembered that he had not been able to hold on to his own farm. Land and census records from this period document Charles Ingalls as working for wages in the Walnut Grove area after the family's return, including a period running a butcher shop. Not farming, not homesteading, buying and selling meat in a small prairie town. There is no gentle way to say this. The man who had promised Caroline a farm, a home, a settled life, the man the books remember as Pa, with the fiddle and the wide prairie sky, was cutting pork in a rented shop. And Laura was watching. She was 11 years old enough to understand the distance between what her father said the future would look like and what the future actually looked like. Old enough to carry the weight of knowing without having the language to say it out loud. She filed it away, into the part of her mind where she kept all the things that would never fit in the children's books. Here is where the ledger, that old farm account book, the one with lines for land and livestock and debts and sales, asks you to look at something uncomfortable. On the Wilder side of the ledger in Burke and Malone, New York, those same years looked entirely different. While Charles Ingalls was driving away from Burr Oak in darkness and returning to Minnesota with nothing, the Wilder family in upstate New York was operating what biographers and land records describe as a genuinely prosperous farm. James Wilder, Almanzo's father, had built something that the Ingalls family never had. A cushion. Not luxury, not ease, but the kind of accumulated stability that means when one bad year comes, the barn is still full enough to survive it. The Wilder barn was large. The granary held through winter. The horses, multiple teams, were working animals that also represented capital, the kind you could leverage or sell if the worst happened. The worst for the Wilders in this period did not happen, not in the way it happened for the Ingalls. What does it mean that 2 men, Charles Ingalls and James Wilder, were farming in the same country, in the same era, during the same economic upheaval of the Gilded Age, and one family's barn stayed full while the other man's family loaded a wagon in the dark? Both worked hard. That is not the question. The question is what was behind them when the hard work wasn't enough. Before we go any further, there is something that needs to be said here, something the Little House books handled with such quiet grace that most readers never noticed the grief underneath it. In the spring of 1879, Mary Ingalls lost her sight. She was 14 years old. The published books attributed it to scarlet fever, and that has long been the accepted account, though more recent medical historians have suggested the cause may have been viral meningoencephalitis, a diagnosis that was simply beyond the vocabulary of frontier medicine in 1879. What the books do not dwell on, and what the historical record makes inescapable, is the question of access. Frontier families in the 1870s Midwest did not have physicians nearby. They did not have money for specialist care. They did not have the kind of resources that might, in a richer household, in a city with capital behind them, have meant a doctor arrived sooner, or that a different treatment was tried. We cannot say with certainty that Mary's blindness was preventable. Medicine in 1879 was primitive regardless of what a family could afford. But we can say this: The Ingalls family had no safety net when the illness came, no reserves to draw on, no family nearby with means to help. Charles Ingalls could not buy his daughter's eyesight back, and the ledger had nothing in it that would have allowed him to try differently than he did. The books gave you Mary's grace, her patience, her extraordinary acceptance. They gave you the quilt blocks and the college for the blind and the determination that Pa would find a way. What they did not give you was the cost of being a child who got sick in a family with nothing behind them, and 3 miles across that same prairie, nobody's daughter was growing up in a family with nothing behind them. By 1879, Charles was restless again. The butcher shop in Walnut Grove had not become the thing he needed it to be. The work was steady enough for a while, but it was someone else's dream, running a shop in a town somebody else had founded, on land somebody else owned. Charles Ingalls did not travel across half the country to spend his life behind a counter. When the word came about Dakota Territory, about land opening up along the railroad line, about a new town being surveyed near Silver Lake, Charles heard it the way a man hears the sound of something he has been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. He went ahead first, alone, working for the railroad survey crew as a bookkeeper and timekeeper near what would become De Smet, South Dakota. He scouted the land, he filed a claim, and then he sent for the family. Carolyn packed again. Laura helped her. They did not talk, as far as any record shows, about the farm at Walnut Grove, or the house in Burr Oak, or the wagon that had left in darkness. They packed the way people pack when they have learned that talking about what might go wrong does not change whether it does. The claim Charles filed near De Smet was on the open Dakota Prairie, in country that was beautiful and brutal in equal measure, grassland that stretched flat to the horizon in every direction, where the wind came without interruption from Canada, and the winters arrived without warning and stayed without mercy. He believed in it. That is the thing about Charles Ingalls that the books actually get right. He genuinely believed in every claim he ever staked. He was not cynical about the land. He was not performing optimism for his family's benefit. He looked at 160 acres of Dakota grassland, and he saw the future he had been building toward for 20 years. The question was whether the land agreed with him. Here is what a homestead claim in Dakota Territory in 1879 actually meant. Not in the story, but in the numbers. 160 acres under the Homestead Act cost almost nothing to file. That was the promise. What it cost to survive on was an entirely different calculation. A settler needed a house, even if it was only a claim shanty, rough lumber, tar paper, minimal insulation against winters that regularly dropped to 30 below. Tools, seed, a team of horses or oxen to break the thick Dakota sod, and breaking virgin prairie sod for the first time was brutal. Exhausting work that destroyed equipment and animals. Food to last through the first winter before the first crop could possibly come in. And time. 5 years of continuous residence and improvement. Minimum before the land was legally yours. A man with capital behind him. A barn full of horses, grain in reserve, family who could extend a loan, could absorb the first 2 or 3 years of thin returns while the land came into full production. A man with nothing behind him was gambling that every season would cooperate, that no crop would fail, that no blizzard would kill the livestock, that no market collapse would make the wheat not worth harvesting. Charles Ingalls had nothing behind him. He filed his claim and he started building, and the land, for a while, seemed like it might finally keep the promise. The winter of 1880 to 1881 is documented in South Dakota historical records as one of the most severe on record in the region. A succession of blizzards so frequent and so violent that the railroad stopped running for months and supply trains could not reach the isolated prairie towns. De Smet was cut off. The Little House books gave it a full volume, The Long Winter, and it is, by any measure, the most honest of all the Little House books about what frontier hardship actually felt like from the inside. The family grinding wheat in a coffee grinder, the hay twists they burned for fuel when the coal ran out, the slow grinding arithmetic of how much food was left, and how many weeks until the trains might run again. What the book also gives you, and this is the part worth sitting with, is Almanzo Wilder, the young man from the New York farm, the one who had grown up with a barn full enough to last through anything, the one whose family had capital and community and time behind them. Almanzo Wilder drove a sled across open blizzard country to bring back a cache of wheat he'd heard a homesteader had stored south of town. He is the hero of The Long Winter. He saves the town, and he did. The historical record supports the broad outline of that story. But here is what the book, by its nature as a love story and a children's book, cannot fully say. Almanzo Wilder could take that risk because he was the kind of man who had been raised to believe that risk, taken boldly, was survivable. That behind a bold move there was something to come back to, a family with means, a name that meant something in the places his family moved through. Charles Ingalls took risks his whole life. He took them from a different starting line. Both men were brave. Only one had a cushion when brave wasn't enough. Here is the thing about the way Laura wrote Almanzo into the Little House story. She loved him, genuinely, obviously, completely. The historical record on this point is not ambiguous. And when you love someone, you tell their story from the inside, which means you tell it the way it felt, not the way it looked from the outside. From the inside, Almanzo was the boy who loved his horses and worked his father's land and drove through blizzards to save the town. And all of that is true. What Laura did not write, what she had no reason to write because it was not the story she was telling, was the distance between the farm she grew up on and the farm he grew up on. She had lived both sides of that distance. She knew what it was to grow up in a family where the cellar was empty and the next meal depended on whether Pa found work. She knew what it was to marry into a family where, at least at the start, the Wilder name carried weight and the Wilder land had value. She never put those two things in the same frame. She wrote Farmer Boy, Almanzo's childhood, as a separate book, a separate world, full of abundance and warmth, and a barn so large and a table so loaded that generations of readers have described it as the most comforting book in the series. She wrote the Ingalls books as a separate world, and she kept those two worlds from touching. Because if they touched, if you held Farmer Boy's full granary next to the Ingalls family's empty cellar, in the same frame, in the same light, the frontier myth of equal opportunity, of everyone starting from the same honest place, would start to quietly come apart. Laura was too careful and too loving, and perhaps too wise about what her readers needed to let that happen. The Wilder farm in New York is gone. The land has changed hands many times over since James Wilder farmed it. There is no museum there, no preserved structure with a wide front porch and original floorboards you can walk across. The Masters Hotel in Burr Oak, Iowa is still standing, still preserved, still open to visitors who want to climb the stairs to the boarders' rooms on the upper floor. The rooms where a 10-year-old girl made beds for strangers because the family needed whatever the work would pay. History preserves what it can. Sometimes what survives is the smaller building, not the bigger one. Sometimes the barn that was full falls, and the hotel on the hill stays. But the ledger, the one with lines for land, livestock, debts and sales, does not care which buildings are still standing. It just keeps the record. And the record says this: 2 families, same country, same era, same faith in hard work and God and the future. One family had a barn behind them, the other family had hope, and in Dakota winter, those 2 things are not the same. Walnut Grove remembered them. That is the part that cuts deepest. Not the leaving, but the coming back. Not the darkness of the Burr Oak Road, but the particular quality of light in a small Minnesota town when a family returns that everyone knew had left owing debts somewhere else. Charles Ingalls was not unknown in Walnut Grove. He had been a neighbour, a church member, a man who borrowed tools and returned them, who showed up when someone needed help cutting timber or raising a wall. The community had watched the Grasshoppers take his fields. They had watched him leave. They understood, in the way that small farming communities always understand, the grammar of frontier failure. And now he was back. No land, no capital. 4 daughters and a wife who'd given birth 4 months earlier. A wagon with everything they owned, which was not much, pulled by horses that were getting older. The question every returned man dreads is not the one people ask out loud. It is the one in the pause before the greeting, the slight recalibration in a neighbour's expression, when they recognise a face they expected to have gone for good. What happened to you? And beneath that, quieter, the one that really stings. What does it mean that you are back? Here is something the Little House books never quite capture about Walnut Grove in the late 1870s. It was a town still deciding whether it was going to survive. The grasshopper plagues of 1874 and 1875 had not only wrecked individual farms, they had destabilised the entire local economy. Merchants who had extended credit to farming families were themselves in debt. The grain elevator had less to process. Property values sagged. Some families had already done what the Ingalls did, loaded up and moved, often east, away from the risk of another catastrophic season. The town that Charles and Caroline returned to in late 1877 was smaller, more guarded, and more exhausted than the one they had left. Redwood County records from this period reflect the regional stress. Land was cheaper, which sounds like opportunity, but mostly reflects how many people were trying to leave and how few were coming in to replace them. The railroad connections that would eventually help stabilize southwestern Minnesota farming communities were still incomplete or unreliable for small producers trying to get grain to market at a price that covered their costs. This matters because it means Charles Ingalls was not returning to a place that had recovered and was ready to lift a hard-working man back onto his feet. He was returning to a community that was still, itself, bleeding. He was adding his family's weight to a structure that was already bending. They did not own land when they arrived back in Walnut Grove. That detail is important enough to say plainly. The house Charles found for the family was rented. The arrangement was modest, consistent with a man who had no capital to put toward a purchase and no credit history in Redwood County that would make a bank sympathetic. He found work where he could, as a butcher for a time, according to biographers who have traced this period in detail, as a labourer, as the kind of man who picks up whatever a small, struggling town needs done and does not ask too many questions about whether the pay is fair. Laura, 10 and 11 years old during this return stretch, was old enough to understand the arithmetic of it. She would go on to become, as an adult, a meticulous manager of the family finances at Rocky Ridge Farm, someone who tracked every expense in the kind of detail that comes naturally to a person who watched scarcity operate at close range for most of her childhood. But at 10, she was still absorbing it, still learning the particular skill of frontier children, how to act as though nothing is wrong when everything is precarious. She started school in Walnut Grove again. She made friends. She existed in the ordinary social world of a small-town Minnesota girl, and all of it was built on a foundation that could be pulled out from under the family again without much warning. That is not a metaphor. That is the literal condition of their lives. By 1879, something happened inside that rented house in Walnut Grove that the Little House books do handle, but perhaps not with the full weight of what it meant economically. Mary Ingalls, 14 years old, became ill. The illness progressed. It took her sight. The disease has been debated by historians and medical researchers for decades. The Little House books attributed it to scarlet fever, which is what the family believed at the time. A 2013 study published in the journal Pediatrics by Dr. Beth Torini and colleagues re-examined the documented progression of Mary's symptoms and suggested that viral meningoencephalitis, inflammation of the brain and its protective covering, was the more likely medical cause, noting that the symptom pattern Laura described did not match a classic scarlet fever progression. That distinction matters medically, but here is what it does not change. A 14-year-old girl went blind, and her family, already living in a rented house with no savings and no land, now had a child with a permanent severe disability in 1879, in a world with no disability support systems, no social security, no safety net of any institutional kind. What that meant in practical terms was this: Mary's future, whatever it would look like, would rest entirely on the Ingalls family's ability to provide for her. She could not farm. She could not take the kind of wage work available to young frontier women. She would need someone to support her indefinitely. Charles and Caroline understood this immediately. The decision they eventually made, to send Mary to the Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton, Iowa, starting in 1881, was not just a loving choice for their daughter's education and independence. It was also the only realistic option for giving her a life beyond total dependence on a family that was struggling to sustain itself. But Vinton cost money. The Dakota Territory had no school for the blind, so attorney V.V. Barnes helped Charles navigate the paperwork. In October 1881, Governor Nehemiah Ordway certified Mary for 5 years at the Iowa College for the Blind, and the territory paid her tuition, room and board. What the family covered was her clothing and travel. Historians and biographers, including John E. Miller in Becoming Laura Ingalls Wilder, have noted that paying for Mary's education at Vinton placed a sustained financial strain on the family that influenced, directly, the decisions Charles made about when to move, where to move, and how quickly he needed to claim land in Dakota Territory. Mary's blindness was not just a personal tragedy. It was an economic pressure that pushed the family forward into the next gamble, and the next gamble would become the most famous chapter in the Little House myth. In 1879, the railroad was moving into Dakota Territory. Specifically, the Chicago and Northwestern Railway was pushing a line through what would become De Smet, in what is now South Dakota. The company needed workers to build the line. It also needed settlers to give the line a reason to exist, people who would farm the land, buy goods shipped on the railroad, and sell grain shipped back east on it. The railroad employed surveyors and construction crews who needed to be housed and fed. Charles Ingalls got a job as a timekeeper and storekeeper for the railroad's surveying camp, a steady wage job, not a farming gamble, which was a notable shift from how he had previously tried to make a living. The family moved to Dakota Territory in 1879. Charles worked the railroad job through the first year. He scouted land. He filed a homestead claim on 160 acres under the Homestead Act of 1862, the same legislation that had shaped the Ingalls family's relationship with land for years. The Homestead Act required a claimant to be the head of a household, or at least 21 years old, to file a claim, pay a filing fee, live on the land for 5 years, and make specified improvements, a house, cultivation of a portion of the acreage. After 5 years of meeting those conditions, the claimant received the land free and clear, the patent signed by the federal government. It sounds, on paper, like the most democratic land policy in American history, and in many ways it was designed to be. But here is what the children's books never explained about the Homestead Act, because explaining it would require acknowledging what it cost to survive those 5 years before the patent came. You still needed money while you waited. You needed seed. You needed tools. You needed a house, even a minimal one, on the claim. You needed food through the winters, which in Dakota Territory in the early 1880s were severe enough to kill cattle in their barns and strand entire towns for months at a stretch. You needed enough of a financial cushion to absorb one bad crop year without losing everything, because on a 160-acre homestead in the Dakota Prairie, one bad crop year was not an unusual event. It was a near certainty at some point in 5 years. The families who successfully proved up on their Homestead Act claims and kept the land afterward were disproportionately the families who came in with some capital behind them, families who had sold property or a business elsewhere and arrived with enough to weather the proving up period without going deep into debt. The families who arrived with nothing but the filing fee and a wagon load of hope, those families had harder odds. You already know which category the Ingalls family was in. The winter of 1880 to 1881 entered Dakota Territory folklore as simply the hard winter, and it earned that name. Snow began in October 1880, far earlier than anyone had prepared for. Blizzard followed blizzard in a sequence that meteorological historians have characterized as one of the most severe winter periods in the recorded history of the Northern Plains. The railroad line into De Smet was blocked by snow for months. Supplies stopped coming in. Fuel ran short. Food supplies across the small settlement communities around De Smet dwindled toward dangerous levels. Laura wrote about it later. The Long Winter, published in 1940, is considered by many literary critics and Laura Ingalls Wilder scholars to be the most emotionally honest of all the Little House books, the one where the danger feels most real, where the hunger is most clearly present, where the family's survival is genuinely uncertain rather than merely dramatic. In the book, the family survives because of a combination of Pa's resourcefulness, community solidarity, and the heroic act of 2 young men, Almanzo Wilder and Cap Garland, who drove a sleigh across open, blizzard-threatened prairie to find a settler named Anderson, who allegedly had wheat stores, and brought back enough grain to keep the town of De Smet alive through the last weeks of winter. That story is substantially true. Almanzo Wilder did make that dangerous trip. Community members did grind that wheat by hand through the remaining weeks of winter. The town did survive. But here is the detail that the long winter softens in ways worth examining. The Ingalls family entered that winter already thin on reserves. The claim on their 160 acres had been filed. The house on the claim was built. But the first real crop year was still ahead of them. They were living on what Charles had earned from the railroad job and whatever small sales the previous short growing season had produced. They ground wheat in a coffee mill for months because that was what they had. Their survival during the hard winter was not a demonstration of frontier self-sufficiency in the proud, romantic sense. It was a demonstration of how close to the edge a family without capital lived, and how the absence of any margin, any reserve, any cushion, meant that a bad winter did not just cause hardship. It caused the kind of hunger that Laura, decades later, still remembered with physical specificity. That specificity is in the book. The grinding cold, the monotony of brown bread made from coarsely ground wheat, the dwindling kerosene. What is quieter in the book is the economic explanation for why the family was so exposed in the first place. Here is where the ledger opens to its most revealing page. In the winter of 1880 to 1881, while Laura Ingalls and her family were grinding wheat in a coffee mill to survive, Almanzo Wilder was living in De Smet on the homestead claim he had filed in 1879. He too was surviving a brutal winter. The trip to find Anderson's wheat was genuinely dangerous, and the courage it required was real. None of what follows is meant to diminish that. But Almanzo Wilder did not go into that winter empty-handed. He had brought something west with him that Charles Ingalls had never had, a foundation. The Wilder family in Malone, New York, James and Angeline Wilder, Almanzo's parents, operated a farm that land records and census data from the 1860s and 1870s describe as one of the more prosperous agricultural operations in Franklin County. The Wilder farm raised Morgan horses, which were a valued and marketable breed. It maintained substantial grain stores. It ran dairy cattle. It was, by the standards of northern New York farming, a going concern. Not wealthy in the way a banker or a merchant might be wealthy, but stable in the way that land-owning farming families with established operations and community roots were stable. Almanzo had grown up knowing what a full barn looked like, knowing what it felt like to have enough feed for the animals, enough grain for the winter, enough capital to absorb a bad season without losing the farm itself. When Almanzo came west, he did not arrive as a man betting everything on a single throw. He arrived as a man whose family had already demonstrated that disciplined farming on good land, over time, produced security. He brought that knowledge, he brought the physical capability, thus the horsemanship, the farming technique, the mechanical competence, that comes from being trained on a working farm by parents who knew what they were doing. He also, according to family accounts and the records examined by Wilder biographers, including William Anderson in The Story of the Ingalls, brought some financial backing in the form of equipment, seed stock, and possibly direct assistance from his family in New York. The contrast with Charles Ingalls in that same winter is not a matter of character. Both men were brave, both worked hard, both survived. But Almanzo survived with a different set of tools, and those tools were not things he had earned in Dakota Territory. They were things he had inherited from a family that started on better ground. Laura was 18 years old when Almanzo Wilder first drove her home from church. She was old enough by then to have absorbed 15 years of watching her father operate from the thinnest possible margin, to know what a man looks like when he is one bad crop away from losing everything, because she had seen that look on Pa's face more than once. She was also smart enough and honest enough with herself to recognize something different in Almanzo. Not wealth, not ease, not the carelessness of a man who had never struggled, but a certain roundedness, a practical competence that had behind it, whether Laura consciously understood this or not, the weight of a family that had not spent 20 years being dismantled by one catastrophe after another. Their courtship, which lasted roughly 3 years and is documented in These Happy Golden Years, the 9th Little House book, is written with a warmth and lightness that reflects Laura's genuine feelings. She was not marrying for financial security in the calculating way. She loved Almanzo Wilder, but she was also a woman who had grown up watching what happened to families without a safety net. And the man she chose was one whose family understood, in a bone-deep way, how to build and maintain one. That choice would be tested almost immediately after their wedding. Laura Ingalls married Almanzo Wilder on August 25th, 1885. She was 18 years old. He was 28. They married quietly, without the big church wedding Caroline might once have imagined for her second daughter. Laura specifically asked that the word obey be omitted from the ceremony vows, a small, notable act of independence that biographers have connected to the fierce self-possession she maintained throughout her life. They moved on to Almanzo's homestead claim south of De Smet. The house was modest, the land was theirs, or would be theirs, pending the final proving up on the claim, and then, almost immediately, things began to go wrong. The crop failures of 1886 and 1887 hit the De Smet area hard. Dakota Territory was experiencing the beginning of a prolonged drought cycle that would devastate the entire region's agricultural economy through the late 1880s. The wheat crops that Almanzo and Laura were depending on to establish their financial footing simply did not come in at the levels they needed. Almanzo contracted diphtheria in 1888. He survived, but the illness left him with nerve damage that affected his legs, a partial paralysis that biographers and medical historians have documented in detail. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life, and was never again able to do the heavy physical labour that farming on the Dakota Plains required. Their daughter Rose was born in 1886. A son, born in 1889, died at 12 days old, unnamed in the public records. Their house burned down in 1889. In 3 years of marriage, the Wilder family had lost their crops, their health, a child, and their house. Laura, 22 years old with a toddler and a husband who could no longer walk without a cane, sat in the wreckage of what she had hoped would finally be the place where things worked out. She knew this feeling. She'd grown up watching it settle over her mother's face. By 1890, Almanzo and Laura Wilder had abandoned their Dakota homestead. The proving up clock had not been met cleanly enough for the patent to be filed under the Homestead Act's terms, a detail that biographers have handled carefully, because the records for this specific claim period are incomplete. What is certain is that they left without the free and clear title that the original homestead dream had promised. They moved first to Spring Valley, Minnesota, where Almanzo's family had relocated from New York. They stayed there briefly, a year roughly, living near his parents, recovering some stability. Then they tried Westville, Florida in 1891, chasing a warmer climate that Almanzo's damaged legs might tolerate better. Florida did not work. The land, the climate, the economy, none of it matched what they needed. They returned north. In 1894, carrying $100 that Laura had carefully saved. Money she had earned from selling butter and eggs, money she'd guarded from every small emergency, with the discipline of someone who had watched too many families reach into a slender reserve and find nothing left. They loaded a wagon and drove south from De Smet toward Missouri. $100. After nearly a decade of marriage, 2 states, multiple crop failures, a burned house, the loss of a child, and a husband's permanent disability, Laura Ingalls Wilder had saved $100. That is what the ledger said. And she drove toward Missouri anyway, because that is the thing about people shaped by frontier poverty. They do not stop moving just because the math is against them. Movement is the only strategy they were ever been taught. The farm they found in the Ozark Hills outside Mansfield, Missouri, was called Rocky Ridge, named with the kind of practical frontier honesty that Laura always favoured for exactly what it was. Rocky, hilly, hard land to work, 40 acres of timber and stone that cost them the $100 Laura had saved and left them starting over again with nothing in reserve. But this time, something was different. This time, they stayed. Almanzo and Laura Wilder would spend the rest of their lives at Rocky Ridge Farm. They expanded it slowly, year by year, acre by acre, until it eventually covered 200 acres. Almanzo built the farmhouse with his own hands, a proper house, not a claim shanty, not a rented room, but a house they owned outright. The apple trees they planted in the Ozark soil took years to bear fruit. The chickens and the dairy cows came slowly. Every improvement was earned the hard way, from a standing start with no family money behind them and no safety net below. And Laura, watching it happen, began to think about writing. She had always written diary entries, letters, notes to herself in the careful handwriting she'd developed in the one-room schoolhouses of Minnesota and Dakota. But in Missouri, in her 40s and then her 50s, she began to write about her childhood in a more deliberate way. The Farm Journal columns she contributed to the Missouri Ruralist starting in 1911 showed the voice she was developing. Direct, warm, clear-eyed about difficulty without being defeated by it. Her readers, rural Missouri farm women mostly, recognized something true in what she wrote, but the books were still a decade away, and before she could write them, she had to decide what to do with the truth she was carrying. The Little House series, written between 1932 and 1943, is one of the most beloved bodies of American children's literature ever produced. It has sold tens of millions of copies across the world. It has been translated into dozens of languages. It shaped how generations of American children understood the frontier, the family, and what it meant to live with courage. Laura built those books carefully over more than a decade, working with her daughter Rose Wilder Lane, a successful journalist and fiction writer who helped her mother shape the manuscripts, tighten the prose, and make the stories publishable for a mainstream children's audience. The process of that collaboration, and the degree to which Rose's editorial hand shaped the final books, has been a subject of serious scholarly discussion for decades. What historians and literary scholars broadly agree on is that the books, as published, reflect a conscious set of choices about what to include and what to leave out. Burr Oak stayed out. Freddie's grave stayed out. The night departure in the dark stayed out. The rented houses stayed out. The feeding mill wages stayed out. The ledger, the one that showed a family running on hope and thin margins for 30 years, stayed in a desk drawer. And what went into the books instead was the version of her father that Laura needed the world to know. The man who played the fiddle, who kept his family warm, who said we'll be all right and meant it with everything he had. She was not wrong to want that. She was not lying. But she was choosing. And the choice she made, to give America a myth rather than a ledger, says something complicated and true about how we handle the parts of our family stories that we love too much to leave unprotected. Go back to Malone, New York. Stand where the Wilder farm stood. The land is still there. The particular quality of northern New York farmland, fertile, well-drained, the kind of ground that rewards patient work with consistent yields, has not changed. The Morgan horse industry that families like the Wilders helped build in Franklin County is documented in county histories and agricultural records. Then go to De Smet, South Dakota. Walk to the site of the Ingalls homestead on the open prairie. The house Charles Ingalls built is still there, preserved, maintained by the Laura Ingalls Wilder Association, which does careful and serious historical work. Stand on that ground. Look at what is around it. Flatlands in every direction. Wide sky. Wind that does not stop. The kind of landscape that asks everything of the people who try to make a life on it and gives back what it gives back on its own terms, in its own time, without negotiating. The Wilder barn back in New York was full because the Wilder family had time. Time to accumulate, to improve the land, to build equity across a generation. Time that frontier conditions, by definition, did not grant to the families rushing west ahead of the railroad, with their filing fees and their hope. Charles Ingalls never got that kind of time. Every time he came close to building something that could hold, Plum Creek, the town work in Walnut Grove, the Dakota homestead, something else came first. A grasshopper, a blizzard, a debt. The barn was never full. The Little House books do not tell you any of this. They tell you about love, and they are not wrong. They tell you about courage, and they are not wrong. They tell you that the frontier built character in the people who endured it, and they are absolutely not wrong. But they do not tell you that not all frontier families started from the same place. They do not tell you that the difference between the family that built a full barn and the family that drove away in darkness was not always a matter of how hard they worked, or how good they were. Sometimes it was a matter of what they started with. Laura understood that. She understood it in her bones, the way you understand things that shaped you before you had words for them. She just could not find a way to put it in a children's book, and maybe that is the most honest thing about the whole story. There is a particular kind of quiet that follows a person who has spent their whole childhood watching a man they love fail at the one thing he wanted most to do. Not a bitter quiet, not a loud one, the kind that settles into the hands, that makes a woman look at a piece of land before she agrees to touch it, that makes her add the numbers twice, then a third time, before she signs anything. Laura Ingalls Wilder was 27 years old when she and Almanzo finally left De Smet for good. It was 1894. The Dakota Territory had taken almost everything from them. A baby boy who lived only 12 days, a house fire that took what the drought had not, and years of hail and heat that kept the ledger deep in the red no matter how hard either of them worked. Almanzo's hands still trembled some mornings. The diphtheria had done something permanent to his legs. Biographers note a partial paralysis, the kind that never fully resolves, that makes a man move more carefully for the rest of his life. He could still drive a team. He could not run. He could not go back to farming the way he once had. Pa had moved the family how many times now? Wisconsin, Kansas, Minnesota, Iowa, back to Minnesota, Dakota, And still the land had not been enough. Laura had watched that pattern for 20 years. She was not going to repeat it. The route they took to Missouri was documented. $100 in cash carried in a small brown bag that Laura later wrote about. She called it the Magic 100, the number they had scraped together over years of careful saving. They travelled roughly 650 miles by wagon from De Smet, South Dakota, to Mansfield, Missouri in the summer of 1894. Caroline Fraser's Prairie Fires traces the journey through Laura's own diary of that trip, a small spare notebook that Laura kept as they moved south through Nebraska and Kansas, watching the land change from Dakota flatness into something greener, more rolling, more forgiving. She noticed the trees. She wrote about them. After years of Dakota prairie where a tree was something you planted and prayed over, the Ozark Hills had timber thick enough to lose yourself in. It felt, she wrote, like relief. They put down $100 on a rocky, undeveloped 40-acre parcel outside Mansfield, money Laura had saved from selling butter and eggs, and took a mortgage for the rest. The land cost them roughly $400 in total, but most of it was debt they carried for years. The place had a one-room log house on it. The land was rough, wooded, stony, not the rich, loan the neighbour your best team farmland that the Wilders had worked back in Burke, New York. This was the kind of land a person with $400 could afford in 1894. It needed years of clearing before it could be truly farmed. They named it Rocky Ridge. Here is the part the legend likes to skip. Rocky Ridge did not become the prosperous apple farm of Laura's later writings quickly or easily. The first several years in Mansfield were genuinely precarious. Almanzo took odd jobs. Laura worked for a time as a seamstress to bring in additional income. The farm's rocky soil resisted the plough. The apple orchard they planted, which would eventually become one of their steadiest sources of income, took years to bear fruit in any meaningful quantity. Land and census records from Wright County in the late 1890s show the Wilders as a modest household, not a thriving one. And yet, there is something in what Laura was doing at Rocky Ridge that Pa had never quite managed to do anywhere. She was staying, not because the land had proven itself first, not because the mortgage was settled and the risk was gone. She was staying because she had made a decision that this ground, these 40 acres of rocks and oak trees and a one-room house, was the last place she was going to build. Almanzo's family had arrived at their New York farm from Canada with capital, community, and established land. They had taken their risks from a position already cushioned by what came before. Laura and Almanzo arrived at Rocky Ridge with $100, a lame husband, and a daughter named Rose who was 7 years old and watching everything. The difference was not work ethic, it was starting position. Rose Wilder was going to matter enormously to this story, but not yet in the way most people think. In 1894, she was just a child watching her mother study a piece of rocky Missouri ground and decide it was worth fighting for. What Rose absorbed in those early years at Rocky Ridge, the arithmetic of survival, the careful management of what little came in, the particular way her mother held a pencil over a farm ledger, would shape the rest of both their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. What we know from the documented record is this: Laura Ingalls Wilder did not become a writer because she had always dreamed of being one. She became a writer because the farm needed money, and writing was something she had always been able to do quietly, efficiently, and well. Her first published piece in the Missouri Ruralist appeared in 1911. She was 44 years old. The column was called Favors the Small Farm Home, and it was practical, plain-spoken, and aimed directly at farm wives who were trying to hold a household together on thin margins. It was not a memoir. It was not nostalgia. It was advice. It was, in other words, the writing of a woman who had spent years doing the actual arithmetic of survival and wanted to share what she had learned. She wrote for the Missouri Ruralist regularly for more than a decade. During that time, Rocky Ridge slowly stabilized. The apple trees matured. Almanzo adapted to what his body could do and found his way back to livestock and a manageable workload. The farm grew from 40 acres to eventually over 200. What they built at Rocky Ridge was real, documented, deed-recorded, paid for. But here is what the record also shows. It was built slowly, carefully, without the kind of safety net that catches a man who falls twice and still has the barn. Think about what that barn means now. We were introduced to it early. The Wilder barn in Burke, New York that James Wilder built when Almanzo was a boy. Big enough to swallow an Ingalls shanty whole, grain stored, horses ready, tools hung in their proper places. That barn was not just shelter for animals. It was the physical evidence that a family had already survived long enough and prospered enough to build something that size. It meant they had reserves. It meant that when a bad year came, and bad years always came, there was something to fall back on. Pa Ingalls never had that barn. He had ambition. He had the fiddle and the stories and the real genuine love of his family. He had the courage to keep moving when things went wrong. But courage and a full barn are different kinds of tools, and they do not protect you from the same disasters. By the time Charles Ingalls died on June 8, 1902, in De Smet, South Dakota, he owned the small house on 3rd Street where he and Caroline had settled after the Homestead years. He had served as Justice of the Peace. He was a respected man in his community. But the land records show no large farm, no consolidated holdings, no barn full of reserves passed down to the next generation. What he left Caroline was modest. What he left Laura was memory. And memory, it turns out, was what Laura was going to spend the next 30 years deciding what to do with. Here is the contradiction that quietly drives everything that comes next. Laura had watched her father's failures up close. She had been on the wagon in the dark. She had helped her mother stretch the thin provisions through another long winter. She had lived the version of frontier life that the books would later leave out. And then she sat down to write about it. Not immediately. Not in 1902 when Pa died, or in 1911 when she started writing farm columns. The actual work of turning her childhood into the little house books did not begin in earnest until the late 1920s, when Laura was in her 60s and the farm at Rocky Ridge was stable enough that she had time to think. What would you leave in? What would you leave out? She left in the fiddle. She left in the warmth and the wildness of the prairie nights and the way Pa could make even a dugout feel like home. She left in the grasshoppers and the hard winter and the blind Mary sitting at the window. She left in the texture of a life that was genuinely, meaningfully hard in ways she wanted children to understand. What she left out was Burr Oak, the unpaid rent, the wagon in the darkness. And here is the thing about what she left out. It was not the poverty that embarrassed her. It was the shape of the poverty. The specific night, the specific departure, the moment when the gap between who Pa wanted to be and what Pa actually was closed too small to hide anymore. The books she gave America showed a family that was poor but proud, always moving forward, always held together by love and work and a father who could build the house himself when he had to. What the books did not show was the night the family left without paying what they owed. Both things were true at the same time. That is what matters. Pa built houses. He also drove away from a debt he could not face. He loved his family completely. He also moved them 9 times, chasing land that never fully kept its promise. He was a man of genuine courage and genuine limitation, and Laura, who had watched both things at close range, made a choice about which one she wanted America to raise its children on. That choice is not a lie. It is something more complicated than a lie. It is a ledger with certain lines left blank. Every family keeps one. The column where the shame lives. The row where the number is too hard to say out loud. The entry that gets carried forward but never quite settled. Laura kept her ledger carefully at Rocky Ridge. She signed the deeds. She paid the mortgages. She watched the apple trees grow. She wrote columns about farm economy for women who needed practical help, not mythology. And then, somewhere in the late 1920s, she sat down and wrote the other ledger, the one that became the Little House books, and she made it beautiful and true and incomplete in exactly the way that love makes all memory incomplete. But there was someone else watching. Rose Wilder Lane had grown up at Rocky Ridge. She had watched her mother's careful arithmetic, her mother's stubborn refusal to leave, her mother's slow building of something solid on that stony Missouri ground. She had also, by the time her mother started writing seriously, become a journalist and author herself, one of the most successful women writers in America in the 1920s. She had travelled to Albania, to Baghdad, to the Soviet Union. She had filed dispatches from places her mother had never been and never wanted to go. And when her aging mother began writing down the story of her childhood, Rose came home to Rocky Ridge, sat at the table across from Laura and began to edit. What Rose brought to the manuscript was not just grammar. It was pacing, structure, drama, the tools of a professional storyteller who knew how to shape a memory into a scene that kept a reader's attention. Biographers have debated for decades exactly how much Rose shaped the Little House books, how much of the voice on the page is Laura's, and how much is Rose's hand guiding the sentence somewhere her mother's instinct hadn't quite reached. What we know from the documented record, from letters, manuscripts, and the scholarly work of researchers including William Holtz, who wrote The Ghost in the Little House, is that Rose's editorial involvement was substantial. The manuscripts passed between them. The language was revised. Scenes were restructured. This does not mean Laura did not write her own books. It means the final product was a collaboration shaped by two women, two generations, two different relationships to the same childhood, one who lived it from the inside, and one who watched it from a child's careful distance and learned what survival looked like before she learned what it was called. Here is what that means for the ledger. By the time the first Little House book was published in 1932, Laura was 65 years old. The Great Depression had been grinding for 3 years. Families all across America were loading wagons, metaphorically and sometimes literally, and wondering whether the land they thought they owned was going to be held. Into that moment, Laura published Little House in the Big Woods, and then Little House on the Prairie, and then On the Banks of Plum Creek, and then the others, one after another, through the 1930s and into the early 1940s. The timing was not accidental. The country needed the story Laura was telling, a story about a family that was poor but not broken, that kept moving but never stopped loving each other, that lost and still got up the next morning and put the fiddle to the chin and played. America needed Pa, and Laura gave them the Pa she wanted to remember. Not the man in the dark loading a wagon he couldn't pay for. Not the father whose ambitions kept outrunning the money. The pair who played Old Dan Tucker in a cosy house, while the winter pressed against the walls and the family was warm inside. She was 65 years old, and she knew exactly what she was doing. This is the moment the barn stops being just a building. Think about what the Wilder barn in New York meant the first time we mentioned it. The size of it, the fullness, the horses in the stall. Think about what the Ingalls cellar meant in those Dakota winters. The careful rationing, the shrinking sacks, the calculation of whether what remained would last until spring. Now put those two images next to each other not as facts about farming, but as facts about what it means to tell a story. Almanzo Wilder grew up knowing that the barn would be full when winter came. The risk his family took on the frontier was real, but it was risk with a floor underneath it. Land in New York still held, a family network still intact, capital that had already proven it could survive a bad season. Laura Ingalls. Wilder grew up knowing that the cellar might not be full when winter came. The risk her family took was real too, but it was risk with no floor. Just the next claim, just the next winter, just the hope that this time the crops would hold. She married Almanzo, she built Rocky Ridge, she wrote the books. And in the books she merged both stories into one American myth. The frontier family, moving west, working hard, loving fiercely, surviving on courage and goodness. The barn and the cellar became the same story. They were not the same story. Which brings us to the question that the ledger asks most quietly, in the column she left blank. If you praise frontier courage, and you should, because the courage was real, do you praise it the same way when one family starts with a full barn and the other starts with an empty cellar? If you build a national mythology around the idea that hard work and love are what kept the pioneer family alive, what do you do with the documented record that shows some pioneer families had more runway than others? That some families had a barn full of reserves when the bad year came, and some families had a wagon in the dark? Laura did not ask this question in the Little House books. She was not trying to write a history. She was trying to write a childhood. Hers, the one she had loved, with the father she had loved, through the winters she had survived. But the question lives in the gap between what she wrote and what she remembered. It lives in the blank column of the ledger. And it is still there, waiting every time someone opens Little House on the Prairie and thinks, this is the story of how America was built. The books were sold. They sold in the Depression when people needed them most. They sold through World War II, when the idea of a family holding together against everything the land could throw at it felt like a promise worth keeping. They sold through the 1950s and into the 1960s, when they were put into school curricula and given to children as the true story of what the frontier had been. And through all of it, Burr Oak stayed out. The rent stayed unpaid on the page. The wagon stayed in the dark where Laura had left it. Rocky Ridge was real. The apple trees were real. Laura Ingalls Wilder built something solid and documented on that stony Missouri ground. Something Pa had never quite managed to do on any of the claims he staked and left. She stayed. She paid the mortgages. She wrote the books. She kept the farm. But underneath the books, running quietly, the way a spring runs underground and only shows itself in certain light, the harder story was still there. The Ingalls cellar, empty again. The Wilder barn, still full. The ledger with the blank column that Laura kept herself. She wrote the first version of it by hand. Not the Little House books. Something rawer than that. Something she had been carrying around in her chest for 50 years, waiting for the moment she could finally put it down. It was 1930. Laura Ingalls Wilder was 63 years old, and the farm at Rocky Ridge was for the first time in their lives genuinely stable. The apple orchard had matured. The house had been expanded, rebuilt, made real. Photographs from this period show a proper farmhouse with a sleeping porch and a stone fireplace, not the rough cabin they had started in. Almanzo was in his mid-70s, slower but still present. Rose had grown into someone famous, a syndicated journalist, a novelist, a woman who had covered stories in Albania and Iraq and the American West, and filed dispatches that ran in newspapers coast to coast. She was making more money per year than most people in America would see in a decade, and she had come home to Mansfield, not because she was done with the world, because her mother was writing. What Laura wrote in 1930 was not the Little House books. It was Pioneer Girl, the autobiography, the adult one, the version with Burr Oak in it, and Freddie's grave, and the years that don't fit cleanly inside a cosy log house. She wrote it straight, plainly, the way a woman who has spent decades writing practical farm columns writes, direct, without decoration, interested in the actual sequence of what happened. She wrote about Iowa. She wrote about the hotel and the saloon and the men who frightened her. She wrote about the night the wagon left in darkness, and then she sent the manuscript out through Rose's literary contacts to see if any publisher wanted it. They didn't. What came back, through agents and editors over the next year or two, was not a flat rejection. It was something more instructive. The manuscript was too episodic. The tone was uneven. The market for adult pioneer memoir was not strong in 1930, when the country had other things to worry about, a banking system cracking at the seams, farms foreclosing across the Midwest, men standing in bread lines in cities that had looked prosperous 8 months before. But the notes hinted at something else, something more commercial. The voice of a girl on the prairie seen through a child's eyes. That might be something. That might be something children would read. Rose understood what that meant before Laura fully did. Here is where the collaboration becomes the story, and here is where the story gets complicated. Rose Wilder Lane, by 1930, was one of the most professionally accomplished writers in America. She had published novels, biographies, and hundreds of articles. She understood structure the way her mother understood soil, intuitively, from years of working it by hand. She knew how to find the emotional centre of a scene and cut everything around it. She knew how a sentence needed to land to keep a reader from looking up. She also had something else, a politics, a philosophy, a set of ideas about individual freedom, government overreach, and the moral virtue of self-reliance that were hardening in the early 1930s into what would later be recognised as the intellectual foundation of American libertarianism. Rose would go on to be named, alongside Ayn Rand and Friedrich Hayek, as one of the founding thinkers of the modern American libertarian movement. She was writing and thinking seriously about these ideas at exactly the same moment she was sitting across the table from her mother, working on manuscripts about pioneer life. You have to hold that in mind. Because the Little House books, the published versions, the ones America raised its children on, are not politically neutral stories about a family that worked hard and loved each other. They are stories about a family that asked nothing from the government, moved when things got hard, and built everything they had through individual effort and determination. The federal land agent is a distant bureaucracy. The neighbours help each other, but no one waits for an institution to save them. The moral architecture of the books is deeply, structurally libertarian in a way that reflects not just Laura's genuine experience, but Rose's ideological convictions about what that experience meant. What Rose brought to the manuscripts was not just grammar and pacing. She brought a frame. The question scholars have argued about ever since is how much of the frame is Rose and how much of it was already in Laura's material. The honest answer is that the surviving record gives us both. William Holtz, who published The Ghost in the Little House in 1993, argued that Rose's editorial involvement was so substantial in certain books, particularly By the Shores of Silver Lake and The Long Winter, that she deserves significant co-authorship credit. Pamela Smith Hill and other scholars have pushed back on the most extreme version of this claim, arguing that the essential voice, memory and authority in the books belongs to Laura, and that Rose's role, while real, was that of a skilled editor rather than a ghostwriter. What is documented, in the letters between them, in the manuscript evidence, is this. Rose received drafts. Rose revised them. She sent back pages with restructured scenes, tightened language, and in some cases substantially rewritten passages. Laura reviewed Rose's revisions, sometimes accepting them, sometimes pushing back. The final books carry both women's fingerprints. The voice you hear when you read Little House on the Prairie, that calm, intimate, present tense-feeling voice that makes you believe you're right there in the moment. That voice emerged from the exchange between them, not from Laura alone at a desk. This does not diminish Laura. It complicates her, which is different. Think about the ledger now. We first mentioned it as a farm account book, rows of land, debts, livestock, crops. The kind of thing James Wilder kept on his prosperous New York farm. The kind of thing Charles Ingalls kept too, except his columns never balanced the same way, because the starting capital was never the same, and the land never held the same way. And when the crop failed, there was nothing behind it to absorb the loss. The ledger came back when we looked at what Rocky Ridge actually was. Not the mythologized apple orchard farm of the books, but the real one. 40 acres of rock and timber bought with $100 in 1894, built up slowly over decades, mortgaged and remortgaged, expanded only as each payment came in. Now the ledger is sitting at a different table, because the manuscript Laura handed Rose in 1930 was, in a sense, the truest ledger she had ever kept. The one with Burr Oak in it. The one where the debts appeared on the correct pages and the departures were recorded honestly. The one where Pa was recognisable as the man his daughter had actually watched, not the man she decided America needed him to be. And what came out the other side, after the rejections, after Rose's editorial hands, after the commercial realities of Depression-era children's publishing, was the other ledger, the one with certain lines left blank. Let's be specific about what that meant for the country that received the books. Little House in the Big Woods was published in 1932. Black Tuesday had happened 3 years before. By 1932, American unemployment was hovering near 25%. Banks were failing every week. Farms were foreclosing across the same Midwest that the Ingalls had crossed in their wagon 50 years before. Families who had believed in hard work and self-sufficiency were watching those things fail them in ways that felt terrifyingly familiar. The crop that didn't cover the debt, the bill that arrived before the money did, the moment when the plan ran out. Into that world, Laura Ingalls Wilder published a book about a family that had almost nothing. No electricity, no store-bought goods, no safety nets, and was warm and loved, and safe inside their cozy log house, while the Wisconsin winter pressed against the walls outside. The country devoured it. Not because people were naive, not because they didn't know hardship. They bought the book because they knew hardship, because they were living it. And the book said something they needed to hear, that it was possible to be poor and whole at the same time. That a family could be thin on money and still be rich in what mattered. That a father who couldn't always provide in the material sense could still be the kind of man who made everything feel all right when he played the fiddle at the end of a hard day. Pa, in other words, was the answer to the Depression's most frightening question. What if hard work isn't enough? The book said, hard work isn't everything, but love is. Family is. The small warm house in the big dark woods is. People needed that. And Laura gave it to them. But here is what the Depression-era reader could not have known. The Pa in those books had already passed through the editorial hands of a woman who believed, philosophically, that government was the enemy of exactly this kind of frontier self-reliance. Rose Wilder Lane, sitting at Rocky Ridge in the early 1930s, was not just helping her mother shape scenes. She was shaping the moral of the story, the part that said these people made it because they relied on themselves, not because anything outside their family helped them. What that framing left out was the structural reality that Caroline Fraser's Prairie Fires would later document so carefully, that Charles Ingalls did not fail because he lacked self-reliance. He failed, repeatedly, because the conditions he was farming in were structurally stacked against small homesteaders with no capital reserves. The Panic of 1873 crashed farm credit. The Grasshoppers in 1875 and 1876 were a regional catastrophe, not a personal one. The Homestead Act promised 160 acres, but gave no guarantee that those acres would produce a living. The frontier wasn't a level playing field where every family's self-reliance was equally rewarded. It was a system in which the families who started with capital, community and established land had a floor under their risk that families like the Ingalls simply did not have. The books don't say that. The books can't say that, because saying it would require putting Pa's failures in the context of systemic economic forces, and that context would undermine the very thing Rose and Laura were building together, the story of individual courage triumphing over individual hardship. Almanzo's family had a barn. Pa's family had the fiddle. Both were real. Only one was enough. Here is the silence beat this chapter has been building toward. When the Little House books became bestsellers, and they did, immediately and decisively, Laura Ingalls Wilder became something she had never been in her own lifetime, financially secure. Not Rocky Ridge stable, not Apple Orchard solvent, actually secure. The royalties came in year after year. Little House on the Prairie was selected for the Newbery Honour in 1938. The Long Winter received a Newbery Honour in 1941. Little Town on the Prairie and These Happy Golden Years both received Newbery Honours too. The books were reviewed seriously, read in schools, given as gifts passed between mothers and daughters. By the early 1940s, Laura Ingalls Wilder, who had spent her entire adult life in the careful arithmetic of barely enough, was a woman with money. She was in her mid-70s. It had taken her the full span of a human life to reach the kind of financial stability that the Wilder family in New York had started from. Think about that. Not as a condemnation of anyone, not as a scorecard, but as a quiet fact sitting at the end of a very long road. The woman who grew up watching her father fail at financial stability, who married the son of a family that had always had more to fall back on, who built Rocky Ridge from 40 rocky acres and $100, who wrote her childhood into books that left the hardest parts out. That woman arrived at security in her 70s by telling a version of her own poverty that made poverty feel like the foundation of everything good. The book said, we had almost nothing, and it was enough. The real record said, it was almost never enough, and we survived anyway. But surviving and thriving are not the same word. There is one more thing that happened in this period that most people who love the Little House books don't know. Her name was Garth Williams, who later illustrated the definitive editions. But the curator who matters in 1937 is the South Dakota school librarian, an educator named Aubrey Sherwood, who kept local newspaper archives and documented the Ingalls family's years in De Smet, with a care that preserved details the family never intended for preservation. What those archives showed, what the local newspapers of De Smet confirmed, was that the historical Ingalls family's time in Dakota Territory was harder than even the Long Winter quite captured, that the homestead claim they filed was contested, that the financial picture in the late 1880s and early 1890s, after the hard winters and the crop failures stacked up, was thin in ways that the book's resolution, Laura and Almanzo marrying, the golden years beginning, papers over with the warmth of a wedding. The books end with Laura becoming a wife. What comes after the ending, the diphtheria, the baby who lived 12 days, the fire, the years of crop failure in Dakota, the departure for Missouri with $100, that is not in the books at all. Laura ended her story before the hardest chapter of her adult life began, which means the ledger the books offer America stops exactly where the most important accounting starts. Both ledgers have always existed side by side. The one America read, and the one that survived in the archives, the one America read, said, "Hard work and love and the courage to keep moving will carry a family through anything the frontier throws at them." The archived one said, "Hard work and love and courage are real and necessary, and they are not always sufficient, and the families who survived with the most to show for it often had something behind them that courage alone cannot replace. That something was the barn. Not every family had one, and the books Laura wrote, brilliant, true, incomplete, shaped by love and ideology and the commercial realities of depression publishing and her daughter's editorial hands, those books made America forget for a century to ask which families did. The ledger is still open, both of them, and the last pages haven't been turned yet. The last photograph taken of Laura Ingalls Wilder shows a woman in her late 80s sitting in a chair at Rocky Ridge Farm, small against the armrests, wrapped in what looks like a Goodwill cardigan. She's not performing for the camera. She's not smiling the way a celebrity smiles. She looks like a woman who has spent a long time thinking about something she is not quite ready to put down. She died on February 10th, 1957, 3 days after her 90th birthday. Almanso had been gone for 8 years by then. He died in October 1949, at 92 years old, still at Rocky Ridge, the farm they had built from the ground up in the Missouri Ozarks 60 years before, the one that started with 40 rocky acres and 100 borrowed dollars, and the stubbornness of 2 people who'd already watched everything fail once and decided to try again anyway. By the time Laura died, the little house books were already permanent American furniture. They were in school libraries in every state. They were the books that mothers who had grown up with them were buying for their own daughters. They were on the shelves of women who had never lived anywhere near a prairie, who had never heard grasshoppers coming in a cloud, who had never watched a blizzard pack so hard against a window that the light disappeared, and those women loved Pa just as fiercely as any frontier child ever had. That is how deep the myth had gone. But here is the thing about myths. They do not stay buried in amber. 57 years after Laura died, a book was published that changed everything quietly. Not with headlines, not with scandal, with footnotes. Pioneer Girl. The annotated autobiography, edited by Pamela Smith Hill and published by the South Dakota Historical Society Press in 2014, was the first fully annotated scholarly edition of the manuscript Laura had written in 1930 and never been able to sell, the one with Burr Oak in it, the one with Freddie in it, the one with the night departure, the unpaid rent, the saloon next door, the years that refused to fit inside a cozy log house. It became a bestseller, not a children's bestseller, a real-world, adult bestseller. The South Dakota Historical Society had printed what they thought was a modest scholarly run, cautious as academic presses are, and it sold out almost immediately. They printed more. It kept selling. Women who had grown up reading the Little House books were buying Pioneer Girl in their 30s and 40s and 50s, holding both texts at the same time, feeling the distance between them. Feeling that distance is different from reading about it. When you hold Pioneer Girl in one hand and Little House on the Prairie in the other, you're not reading 2 different versions of the same story. You're reading the story a woman lived, next to the story she decided America could keep. And the gap between them, which had always been there in the archives, in the biographies, in the footnotes of serious scholarship, is suddenly right there in your hands, undeniable, asking you to sit with it. The 3 years after Pioneer Girl, Carolyn Fraser published Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder. Fraser spent years in the archives, land records, census data, county newspapers, mortgage documents, De Smet homestead files. She pulled numbers that no children's book had ever touched, and what she found confirmed, in granular economic detail, the pattern this documentary has been tracing across every chapter. Charles Ingalls filed multiple homestead claims over his lifetime, at least 5 separate land entries across Minnesota, Kansas, and Dakota Territory. He proved up on only one, the De Smet claim, patented in 1886. But even that success was thin. When he sold it in 1892 for $1,200, it carried a $760 mortgage, leaving him less than $400 in net profit after more than 30 years on the frontier. He was a man who moved because moving felt like the next right answer, because the alternative was admitting that the current place had stopped working, and a man with his philosophy of self-reliance could not quite bring himself to do that. Every time he loaded the wagon, it was not an act of defeat in his own mind. It was an act of optimism, and that optimism, genuine, stubborn, almost beautiful, cost his family more than it ever gave them back. Fraser won the Pulitzer Prize for biography in 2018. She did not write a takedown, she wrote an accounting. And the accounting, when you lay it out in full, looks like what the ledger has always looked like when you are honest about what belongs on which side of the column. Now let's talk about what happened that same year, 2018. In June of 2018, the American Library Association announced that it was renaming its Children's Literature Award. The award had been called the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award since 1954. It had been given to authors and illustrators of children's books who had made a substantial and lasting contribution to literature for children. It was one of the most prestigious honours in American children's publishing. They renamed it the Children's Literature Legacy Award. The stated reason was that Laura Ingalls Wilder's portrayals of Native Americans and Black Americans in the Little House series were inconsistent with core American Library Association values. The books contain passages in which Native people are described in terms that 21st century readers, and most honest 19th century readers, would recognise as dehumanising. Little House on the Prairie includes a memorable line in which a neighbour states flatly that the only good Indian is a dead Indian, a line that Charles Ingalls pushes back on gently, but which the narrative frames without the full moral weight it demands. The representation of Black Americans in the series is similarly troubled. The ALA's decision was controversial. Some readers saw it as erasure, others saw it as accuracy. But here is what is worth sitting with. The award rename was not really about the book's literary merit. No one argued that Laura Ingalls Wilder had not written books that shaped American childhood. The argument was about what those books did alongside shaping childhood, what they carried inside them about who deserved to be seen as fully human on the frontier, and who the frontier myth had decided to minimise in order to make the self-reliance story feel clean. The same editorial hand that softened Pa's economic failures had also smoothed over the way the land Pa kept homesteading had been taken from the people who lived on it before him. The myth worked by leaving things out. That is what myths do. Go back to the three things planted at the beginning of this documentary: the barn, the ledger, the word risk. We first saw the barn in northern New York on the Wilder family farm in Franklin County, big enough to shelter cattle and horses and hay enough for a hard winter. Proof of a family whose hard work had been backed by time and good land, and the kind of rooted capital that doesn't vanish in a single bad season. We saw, set against it, the Ingalls cellar, thin, stretched, dependent on whatever the harvest had managed to leave behind. Those two images were never just buildings. They were the physical answer to a question the Little House books asked but never answered directly. Why did one family arrive at the frontier with tools, animals, and a plan, and another family arrive with determination and not enough behind it? The barn comes back now for the last time. Rocky Ridge Farm, Mansfield, Missouri, the farmhouse Laura and Al Manzo built over 60 years, still stands. You can visit it. The house has been expanded and renovated from the original rough cabin. It shows the decades of careful, incremental building that defined everything the Wilders did in Missouri. The barn on the property is modest. It was never the barn of the Wilder farm in New York, but it existed. It held animals. It held the evidence of what two people had managed to accumulate across a lifetime of choosing to stay in one place and work it. Laura and Al Manzo stayed at Rocky Ridge. They did not move again after Missouri. That in itself is a kind of answer to something. The ledger. We introduced it as a farm account book, the kind of document that records debts and credits in the same columns, that does not let you subtract a failed harvest from the record just because looking at the number is painful. The Little House books are a ledger too, but one that balances differently. They record courage, love, music, cold nights and warm fires, the smell of bread baking in a cabin while snow packed against the walls. All of that is real. All of it belonged to the Ingalls family as surely as any number in any archive. What the book's ledger doesn't fully carry is the debt column, the 5 failed homestead claims, the night departure from Burr Oak, Freddie's grave in a Minnesota field, unmarked in a location that has never been found. The mortgage on Rocky Ridge that Laura and Almanzo carried for years before the royalties finally cleared it. The baby boy born to Laura and Almanzo in 1889, who lived 12 days and died without being given a name in the family record. A grief so private that it barely surfaces anywhere in Laura's published writing, folded away like a document too painful to file where anyone might find it. Pioneer Girl tried to be the complete ledger, the one that didn't leave the hard numbers blank. It was unpublished for 84 years, and when it finally came out in 2014, women across America bought it immediately, not because they wanted to destroy what they loved, but because they already suspected the other ledger existed. They had felt its edges in the books without knowing it. They knew, the way you know when something is slightly too neat, that the real story had more weight to it than the one they had been given. They were right. And now the word risk. We said early in this documentary that both Pa Ingalls and Almanzo Wilder took risks. That risk on the American frontier was supposed to be the great equalizer, the thing that made every man's courage worth the same amount because every man had something to lose. But we have spent the entire length of this documentary looking at what something to lose actually meant for two different families. Almanzo's family risked from the Wilder farm in New York. They risked from a position of land, livestock, horses in the barn, grain in the granary, a community network that could absorb a bad year or two without the whole structure collapsing. When Almanzo came to Dakota Territory as a young man to homestead, he came with the confidence, the physical, embodied confidence, of someone who had watched risk pay off for his family over and over again. He knew what success looked like because he had grown up inside it. Charles Ingalls risked from a dugout, from a one-room claim shanty, from the hotel in Burr Oak that wasn't his. He risked from the position of a man who had almost no cushion under him, who had no family farm to return to if things went sideways, who absorbed every failure directly into his family's daily life because there was nowhere else for the failure to go. Both men believed in risk. Both men took it willingly, even joyfully. But frontier risk was never the same risk for every man, and the books never said that. There is a version of this documentary that ends by asking you to stop loving Little House. This is not that version. Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote books that gave something real to millions of people, something about warmth and family and the possibility of getting through the worst winter you have ever seen if the people you love are in the room with you. That is true. It was true when she wrote it. It is still true. What this documentary has tried to do, slowly, over every chapter, is hold both things at the same time. The books and the record. The myth and the archive. The Pa who played the fiddle and the Pa who drove away in the dark. The barn that was always full and the cellar that was sometimes not. Because here is what the full record actually says when you put it down honestly on both sides of the ledger. Charles Ingalls was not a failure. He was a man who kept trying inside a system that gave him almost no margin for error, in an era when the myth of the frontier said that trying hard enough was always sufficient, when the evidence all around him said otherwise. And he kept choosing to believe the myth anyway, because the myth was the only thing standing between his family and despair. Laura Ingalls Wilder was not a liar. She was a daughter who loved her father, and a writer who understood what children need, and a woman who made a conscious choice to give America the pair it could hold on to rather than the Pa the ledger recorded, because she knew, better than anyone, that sometimes the story that keeps people going matters as much as the story that happened. And Almanzo Wilder, quiet Almanzo, who barely speaks in this documentary the way he barely speaks in the books, was a man who benefited his whole life from a head start he did not choose and did not refuse, who married a woman who had never had one, and who spent 60 years at Rocky Ridge watching her build something out of almost nothing, the way people build when there is no barn behind them to fall back on. The Masters Hotel in Burr Oak, Iowa still stands on its original site. It is the only childhood home of Laura Ingalls Wilder that has not been rebuilt, relocated or replaced. It is the real building from the real year. The hill it was built into is still there. The town around it is small and quiet. The kind of town you drive through without slowing down unless you know to look. But if you stop, if you walk into that building and stand in the room where a 9-year-old girl lay awake listening to rough men in the saloon next door, In the year after the Grasshoppers took everything and the baby brother died and the family had nothing left to fall back on, you were standing in the room that never made it into the books. You were standing in the chapter Laura left in the dark, and now you know why she left it there. Not because it wasn't true, because it was too true. Because some ledgers, the ones with the real numbers, the real debts, the real dark roads at 3 a.m, are not the ledgers you hand to a child who still needs to believe that Pa's going to make everything all right. The wagon drove away from Burr Oak in the summer of 18something. The books Laura wrote said it never happened. The town it drove away from is still standing, and both of those things are true at the same time, which is not a contradiction. It is just what it looks like when a daughter does the most human thing there is. She protected her father. She protected him in the only way a writer knows how. She gave him to the world as the man he tried to be, and she kept the rest, the dark road, the unpaid rent, the wagon turning quietly onto the road before sunrise. She kept that part herself. She carried it all the way to Rocky Ridge, and she never put it in a book.